There's a silence in you that no one hears, a silence that doesn't beg to be broken. It just waits. Behind every smile, every nod, every polite "I'm fine," something remains untouched, an unspoken weight that lingers long after conversations end. You don't show it? You've learned not to. Because somewhere along the way you were taught directly or subtly that being fully seen was dangerous. So you crafted a mask. One that fits. One that works. One that's been worn for so long it started to look like your face. But every now and then, in the stillness, or after a long night, or in the mirror before you put the mask back on, you feel it, the quiet ache of a life that isn't quite yours. A version of you that performs, pleases, adapts, but no longer breathes freely. Carl Jung called this mask the persona, the social identity we construct to meet the expectations of the world. It's not inherently false. It's a necessity. Without a persona, we'd be raw nerves in a world of glass. But what happens when the mask stops being a tool and becomes a prison you were not born to perform? But from an early age, you learned to scan the room before entering it. You watched how others were treated. You noticed which parts of yourself made people uncomfortable. So you tucked them away. Your sadness became silence. Your curiosity, conformity. Your anger, politeness. You didn't lie. You adjusted. You survived. And each adjustment, subtle as it was rewarded. Fitting in became more important than feeling real. But here's the truth most people are too afraid to admit. The persona doesn't just protect you from others. It also protects you from yourself. Because the person you buried under that mask, the real you, holds not just your brilliance and uniqueness, but also your unresolved pain, your unmet needs, your failures and fears. And facing that truth would undo everything. We often think we want authenticity, but that's only half true. What we really want is acceptance without risk. But life doesn't work that way. Wholeness comes at a cost, and the price is the illusion of perfection you've built to feel safe. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone look at you, really look, and it made you uncomfortable? Not because they were judging, but because they saw something behind your words. That moment, that brief collapse of the persona, it terrifies us. Because it reveals how much of us is hidden even from ourselves. Jung warned that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself and others think one is. It's a facade, a filter, a necessary fiction. But when you mistake it for your truth, you begin to confuse connection with performance. You say what people want to hear. You show what they want to see. And you convince yourself that their love is real even when it's only reaching the surface. But beneath all this, your soul is still there, waiting. Not loudly. Souls don't scream. They whisper. Through restlessness, through sudden sadness, through the unexplained hollowness that follows applause. You feel it when you succeed, but don't feel fulfilled. You feel it when you laugh and still feel alone. You feel it when no matter how good things look on paper, something in you remains untouched. That's the grief of living through a persona. It's not dramatic. It's slow, silent, a kind of erosion. You don't notice it all at once. But year after year, it wears you down. You become excellent at appearing, but forget how to feel. You lose contact with your instincts. You stop trusting your emotions. Even joy feels muted, like you're watching your own life from behind glass. Eventually, you start to wonder, who am I really? But you're afraid of the answer. Because the truth is, you don't know. Not fully. You've spent so much time becoming who you needed to be, you forgot who you were before the need began. This is the psychic cost of the persona. It fragments you. What was once whole becomes compartmentalized. You start living in roles: the good daughter, the successful man, the helper, the fixer, the quiet one, the strong one. And behind every role is a story you were never allowed to tell because the world wouldn't accept it, and you couldn't risk rejection. But here's what they never told you. The parts of you that feel too much, speak too little, want too deeply, fear too irrationally, those are not flaws. They are doorways. Doorways to your real self. The one that existed before the mask. The one who still remembers what it felt like to be free. You are not broken. You are buried. And the longer you wear the mask, the harder it becomes to remember the contours of your original face. But the soul never forgets. That's why the longing returns. That's why no matter how much you achieve or how much you're loved, something in you remains unsatisfied. Because no amount of external validation can substitute for internal recognition. You can be praised by 1,000 people and still feel unseen if the one being praised is not the one you truly are. And so the question must be asked, not gently, but honestly. Are you living behind a mask? And if so, who's living your life? Most people never remove the mask. Not because they enjoy it, but because they forget it's there. Over time, the persona becomes second skin. You adapt a just shapeshift into whatever gains approval. And at first it works. You get praised. You get accepted. You become the person others want you to be: efficient, likable, reliable, charming. But eventually you begin to realize approval is not the same as love. Praise is not the same as peace. Validation is not the same as intimacy. And when those realizations start to surface, they don't come gently. They come as crisis. An identity crisis isn't just confusion, it's rebellion. A quiet inner revolt against a version of yourself that no longer feels real. It begins when the things that used to excite you go dull. When people you once impressed no longer matter. When everything you've built starts to feel like a performance you can't remember agreeing to. You may call it burnout, or depression, or numbness. But beneath those symptoms lies something more fundamental: disconnection. Disconnection from your essence. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what happens when your why was chosen by someone else? By your parents, by your culture, by your fear of being alone? What happens when the life you're living, the dreams you chase, the relationships you maintain, the self you display, isn't rooted in your inner truth, but in survival? You begin to feel like a ghost inside your own life. Present, but not alive. Carl Jung knew this path well. He saw the persona not just as a mask worn for others, but as a defense mechanism, one that helps us navigate society, but also distances us from the depths of the unconscious. And in Jungian psychology, the unconscious is not a pit of irrational fears. It is the source of your true self. The parts exiled by shame, the voice drowned out by noise, the wild, untamed soul that never fit inside the costume. This is where the shadow begins to form. The shadow isn't evil. It's simply everything you had to hide in order to be accepted. Your anger, your sensuality, your sadness, your ambition, even your joy if it was ever too much for someone else to handle. These pieces didn't disappear. They just slipped into the dark behind the persona. And from that place, they shape your life silently. Have you ever felt a sudden surge of emotion that didn't make sense? Or said something you didn't mean, as if another part of you took over? That's not weakness. That's your shadow speaking. It's the voice you silenced so long ago, finally asking to be heard. The tragedy of the persona is that it convinces you the mask is your only safe space. But in truth, it's a barrier not just between you and others, but between you and yourself. You may be surrounded by people who love your persona, but feel deeply alone. You may be praised for your strength while hiding an unbearable vulnerability. You may be admired for your kindness while resenting how much you've had to suppress. And because these contradictions can't be reconciled within the persona, they manifest in the body. Tightness in the chest, chronic fatigue, a sense of being on edge, even when nothing is wrong. The body remembers what the mask tries to forget. And here's where the pain deepens. The longer you wear the persona, the harder it becomes to take it off. Because doing so risks everything. If you stop being who they expect you to be, will they still stay? If you stop performing, will you still be enough? If you speak your truth, will it ruin the life you've built? These are not easy questions. But they are necessary, because there's a deeper kind of suffering, the kind that comes not from being rejected, but from rejecting yourself daily in small, quiet ways. Every time you silence your opinion, every time you fake a smile, every time you say yes when you mean no. These are not small acts. They are self-abandonments. And over time, they carve out a hollow space inside you where authenticity used to live. And still we justify it. We tell ourselves we're being professional, polite, easygoing. But beneath those words lies a truth we rarely speak. We are afraid. Afraid of being seen, afraid of being judged, afraid of being too much or not enough. And the persona becomes our shield, our camouflage, our socially accepted form of self-erasure. But there is no intimacy without vulnerability, no joy without risk, no freedom without truth. And so long as you live behind the mask, you'll never fully taste life. You'll only mimic it. You'll go through the motions, you'll say the right things, you'll smile at the right time. But it will all feel muted, like watching your own life through a screen you can't touch. You were not born to be palatable. You were not born to shrink. You were not born to be half alive for the comfort of others. You were born to be whole. And wholeness begins the moment you realize the persona isn't bad. It's just incomplete. It's a costume that helped you survive. But now, maybe survival isn't enough. Maybe now it's time to live. The mask did its job, but you've outgrown it. And somewhere in your bones, you know it. The question is no longer whether the world will accept you. The question is, will you? There comes a moment in every life, quiet, piercing, unplanned, when the mask begins to crack. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's in the middle of a routine conversation when you suddenly hear yourself speaking and realize you don't believe a word you're saying. Or in the silence after a long day when no one is watching and yet the sadness creeps in like fog surrounding everything you thought made sense. That's the moment when the persona starts to tremble under the weight of your truth. You might call it a breakdown. Jung called it the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, beneath who you were taught to be. It's not comfortable. It's not clean. And it's certainly not convenient. But it's real. And that finally is enough. This unraveling isn't madness. It's memory. The soul remembering what it once was before it learned to obey. You were not born with a name or a role. You were born as a presence, undefined, limitless, instinctive. And then piece by piece you were shaped into something digestible, into something familiar, into someone the world could label and manage. But there's a cost to being managed. You forget your original language. You forget how to live from the inside out. You become fluent in appearances and starved of essence. And then the symptoms begin. Emptiness, anxiety, self-sabotage, feeling like you're watching yourself from outside your own body. These aren't flaws. They are signals. The psyche doesn't communicate in words. It speaks in sensation, in repetition, in dreams, in discomfort. And when your inner life is denied long enough, the unconscious begins to push back. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." But what is the unconscious, really, if not the self you've disowned in order to survive? The emotions you repressed, the desires you silenced, the instincts you buried because they didn't fit the story you were told to play out. And every time you betray yourself to protect your image, that shadow grows stronger. Not to punish you, but to balance you. Because nature abhors falsehood. And the longer you live out of alignment, the more life will disturb you, not to destroy, but to awaken. You cannot fake your way to wholeness. No amount of productivity, praise, or pretense can fill the space where truth belongs. And this is where most people freeze. Because the path forward isn't clear. What does it mean to live without a mask? Does it mean total honesty? Does it mean throwing away everything you've built? Not necessarily. Individuation isn't about rebellion for its own sake. It's about integration. You don't destroy the persona. You see it for what it is, a role, not your reality. You begin to notice when it takes over. When you laugh too loudly at jokes you don't find funny. When you nod in agreement just to keep the peace. When you offer help out of habit, not because your soul is willing. These small betrayals accumulate. And each time a piece of you drifts further away, until one day you feel like a stranger in your own story. But this realization isn't the end. It's the threshold. Beyond the mask is not chaos, but clarity. Beneath the surface is not weakness, but wildness. When you stop trying to be liked and start trying to be whole, you will lose people. That's true. The ones who loved your mask may not love your truth. But what you gain is irreplaceable inner coherence. No more performing. No more pretending. No more smiling through your own silence. Adler once said that every human being has a deep longing to belong. But belonging doesn't mean assimilation. Belonging means being seen as you are, not as you present. And the painful truth is, you cannot be seen if you're always performing. You may be admired, yes. But admiration is not the same as love. Because real love, requires depth. And depth only appears when the mask falls. So what does the journey back look like? It's not grand. It's not loud. It's subtle. A reclaiming. A soft returning. It starts with small acts of honesty, saying, "I don't know when you don't," saying no without apology, letting yourself cry without covering your face, letting silence sit between you and another person without rushing to fill it. And sometimes it's in admitting to yourself, "I don't want to be this version anymore." That sentence, as simple as it sounds, can be a revolution. It's the moment your soul stops negotiating, the moment your truth steps forward, not because it's ready, but because it's tired of being hidden. From there, the old identity begins to loosen. The roles you played, the habits you performed, the beliefs you never questioned, that they start to fall away like leaves in late autumn. Not because you hate them, but because they no longer fit the person you're becoming. And this becoming, It's not something you chase. It's something you allow. You don't force the self into existence. You create space for it. You become honest enough, still enough, soft enough to listen. And what you'll hear in that silence is something you've forgotten how to trust your own voice. Not the one trained to be clever or agreeable or impressive, but the voice underneath, the one that speaks in instinct, in curiosity, in longing. The one that says, "This is not who I am anymore." And maybe never was. What happens when the mask finally falls, not in a single moment, but gradually, when you stop holding it so tightly? When you stop arranging your life around who you think you're supposed to be? When the need to be liked loses its grip? When silence becomes more nourishing than small talk? When you walk away from the roles that once gave you meaning and realize you didn't lose yourself? You found her. You found him. You found what was waiting beneath the surface the entire time. But it's disorienting at first. When you no longer have the persona to guide your interactions, you begin to question everything. What do I actually like? Who am I when I'm not pleasing, fixing, performing what's real and what was inherited from people I wanted approval from? These questions don't come with immediate answers. They come with grief. Because letting go of the mask also means letting go of the life it built. The friendships based on mutual pretending. The praise that only came when you suppressed yourself. The identity that felt safe because it was familiar, even if it was suffocating. And that's the paradox. Becoming who you truly are will cost you who you've been. You will feel alone at times. The old version of you will die 1,000 subtle deaths in quiet rooms, in uncomfortable silences, in conversations where you finally say what you mean and notice the other person pulling away. And still something in you knows this is the path. The only one that doesn't leave you hollow. Because once the soul awakens, it doesn't go back to sleep. Not without pain. And the persona once seen clearly no longer offers protection, only limitation. Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But privilege doesn't mean ease. It means responsibility. The responsibility to stop hiding, to live in alignment, to tell the truth even when your voice shakes. You don't have to announce this transformation to the world. It won't look like fireworks. It'll look like boundaries, like slower mornings, like saying no to invitations that feel off, like choosing solitude over shallow connection, like walking away from what once made you feel valuable. Because now you know your worth is not a performance. Some people will misunderstand. They'll say you've changed. They're right. But what they won't see is that this isn't new, it's ancient. You're not becoming someone else. You're returning to the self before the story, to the child before the conditioning, to the truth before the performance. And with that return comes clarity. You start to notice the people who see you without needing you to impress them, the places that make your nervous system relax, the work that feels aligned with your soul's voice. You notice your inner compass reactivating. You stop asking others for directions. This is the slow emergence of the real self. The one you abandoned in order to survive, now stepping back into the light. And it's here in this quiet emergence that something sacred occurs. You begin to live in coherence. No more contradiction between what you say and what you feel. No more performance behind your eyes. No more inner split between the mask and the mirror. You become one. And that oneness, that alignment, is magnetic, not because it seeks attention, but because it radiates something rare, authenticity. The real kind. The raw kind. The kind that doesn't sparkle or shout. The kind that feels like home. This is what most people are starving for, even if they can't name it. Not more content, not more noise, but more real, more soul, more human. The journey doesn't end here. There's no final destination. Individuation is not a fixed state. It's a lifelong process of becoming, of choosing to stay close to your truth even when it's inconvenient, of catching yourself when the mask starts creeping back, of holding space for both your light and your shadow without letting either define you. But now at least you know. You know what the mask feels like. You know what pretending costs. And more importantly, you know what it means to feel whole. And so the real question is no longer, are you living behind a mask? The question is, will you keep wearing it now that you know? Because the mask is seductive. It offers quick acceptance, easy answers, predictable praise, but it can't offer intimacy, or freedom, or truth. And if you've listened this far, it's because something in you is already shifting, already questioning, already reaching for something deeper than image, louder than words, stronger than approval. Maybe it's your soul. Maybe it's the child you used to be. Maybe it's the truth you buried so long ago you forgot it had a voice. But now it's speaking. In the way your body relaxes when you're alone. In the way your heart aches when you pretend. In the way your dreams no longer make sense inside the mask. That's not weakness. That's awakening. You don't have to tear everything down today. But you do have to choose. Because the longer you delay, the more life you live that doesn't feel like yours. And eventually pretending becomes permanent. And the tragedy of a false life is that even when you win, you lose. So let this be the moment. Quiet but clear. The moment you stop chasing acceptance from others and start seeking recognition from within. You were not meant to be a mask. You were meant to be a mirror for your own soul and for others who forgot what real looks like. And when you remember who you are, you give others permission to remember too. That's how the world changes, not with noise, but with truth. One mask removed at a time. Why we fear our own depth. The unconscious speaks in symbols. There's a silence inside you that you've learned not to disturb. Not because it's peaceful, but because it's deep. Too deep. Like standing at the edge of a black ocean and knowing that if you stare too long, something ancient will stare back. So you keep moving. You keep talking. You keep distracting yourself with tasks, texts, images, goals, habits, anything to keep from feeling the pull. But late at night, or when life slows down, or when something collapses, a job, a relationship, a version of you, the silence opens again. And you feel it. The depth. The bottomless, wordless thing inside you that you can't fully name. But that's always been there. Watching, waiting. Most people think they're afraid of failure, or rejection, or being alone. But that's not quite it. What we really fear in the marrow of our being is our own unconscious. Not the idea of it, not the theory, but the experience of it. The moment we lose control, the moment a dream wakes us up sweating, the moment a memory we thought was buried comes back in a flash of emotion we can't explain. That's when the surface fractures, and we realize we're standing on a glass floor. Beneath it, something vast moves slow, dark, symbolic. This is the unconscious, not just a container of forgotten thoughts, but a living, breathing world beneath the ego's control. Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to map this world. He didn't describe the unconscious as a simple vault of memories. He saw it as a psychic realm that speaks its own language, the language of symbols. Not facts, not logic. Symbols. Why? Because symbols can carry paradox. They hold tension. They point to what cannot be spoken in plain terms. The snake, the sea, the fire, the mirror, the shadow, the mask, all of these appear in our dreams, our myths, our fantasies, not to entertain us, but to reveal what we've repressed, forgotten, or denied. But here's the painful truth. We don't fear the darkness because it's foreign. We fear it because it's familiar. We recognize what the symbol implies. We know the shadow we see in the dream is not some abstract monster, it's a part of us. The jealous part, the violent part, the wounded part, the part that was never allowed to speak. And the moment that recognition begins to stir, something ancient in us panics. Because if that part is real, if what we've hidden is part of who we are, then the entire performance begins to unravel. You might feel this as anxiety, as a sudden heaviness in your chest, as a sense that you're drifting away from yourself. But in truth, it's the opposite. You're being pulled back into the center, into the core, into the psychic depth you've avoided your whole life. The unconscious is not your enemy, but it is powerful, and it does not care about your convenience. It wants only one thing: integration. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is not a poetic metaphor. It's a psychological law. Whatever remains unconscious doesn't just disappear, it drives us silently. Through compulsions, through projections, through unexplained desires and sabotages. You think you chose that partner, that career, that coping mechanism. But how much of that choice was truly yours, and how much of it was an adaptation to a deeper fear, a forgotten wound, a repressed emotion now directing your life from behind a mask? The unconscious speaks in symbols because it bypasses censorship. It knows you'll rationalize your feelings. You'll explain them away. So it sends dreams instead. Accidents, intuitions, obsessions. It whispers through art, through memory, through synchronicity. A symbol doesn't argue. It shows you something you're not yet willing to admit. Like the sudden image of a locked door, a sinking ship, a burning room. You wake up sweating, heart racing, confused, but somewhere inside you know what it means. You just don't want to. And that's the root of the fear. The terror of facing something that will demand you change. Because symbols don't just inform, they confront. They reveal the cost of the false self. And they ask a dangerous question: what have you been avoiding that's been shaping you all along? There's a reason most people stay at the surface. It's safe there. You can pretend, you can perform, you can control. But in the depth, in the quiet chaos of the unconscious, control dissolves. Ego fragments, certainty fades, and something older takes over. Something instinctive, something raw, something true. You've felt it before. In the intensity of a heartbreak that made you question your entire identity. In a piece of music that unlocked tears you didn't know you were holding. In a moment of stillness where you suddenly felt ancient grief or unexplainable awe. That was the unconscious speaking, not in words, in symbols, in feeling, in energy. It doesn't speak to the mind. It speaks to the soul. And the soul remembers. The soul remembers what the mind tries to forget. The guilt, the shame, the unlived life, the dreams you abandoned to survive, the desires you buried to be accepted. All of it, lives in the unconscious. And when you begin to touch that layer, it doesn't just change how you feel. It changes who you are. Because once you begin to feel your own depth, the surface will never satisfy you again. There's a moment subtle but irreversible when the psyche begins to shift, when the unconscious, long buried beneath the noise of daily life, stirs for the first time in years. It's not loud, it's not obvious. It begins with restlessness, a discontent that has no clear cause. Your job still pays, your relationships still exist, your body still moves, but something feels off, like you're living in a skin that no longer fits. This isn't depression. It's not anxiety in the clinical sense. It's symbolic dissonance. The outer life no longer reflects the inner truth. And because the psyche demands balance, the unconscious starts to break through dreams, through moods, through breakdowns disguised as burnout. And we panic. Because something in us knows. This isn't just stress. This is a signal. The symbol is knocking, and we don't want to open the door. Jung observed this countless times in his clinical work. People who appeared completely functional on the surface. High achievers, caretakers, people-pleasers, intellectuals, and yet underneath they were being devoured by a kind of invisible hunger. A hunger not for more things, but for meaning, for integration, for wholeness. And the longer they denied the call of the unconscious, the louder the symptoms became. Not as punishment, but as invitation. But that invitation is terrifying. Because what the unconscious offers is not comfort. It offers confrontation. The symbol is not polite. It shows you what you are missing, not abstractly personally. That snake in your dream isn't just a snake. That collapsing house isn't just anxiety. That recurring figure, half human, half animal, isn't meaningless. These are not random artifacts of imagination. They are messages, condensed expressions of your psychic life. The house might represent your identity structure, once solid, now cracking. The animal may be your instinct, long denied, now demanding embodiment. The snake might be transformation feared because you sense it requires the death of an old self. And this is why we fear our own depth. Because the symbols don't flatter us. They dismantle us. They don't speak to the ego's desire to be liked or praised or understood. They speak to the soul's need to become whole, even if that means destroying the life you spent years carefully building. You begin to realize the fears you've lived by weren't born from logic. They came from archetypes, from imprints, from inherited narratives embedded so deep in your unconscious that you thought they were your personality. You weren't afraid of change. You were afraid of becoming someone your family wouldn't recognize. You weren't afraid of failure. You were afraid of facing the part of you that always felt inadequate. The symbol doesn't lie. It bypasses your excuses and delivers the essence. Brutal, but liberating. Nietzsche once wrote, "When you look into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you." Most people quote this as a warning, but they misunderstand. The abyss is not evil. It is essential. It is the space within you that has never been spoken aloud. The abyss is your potential, your pain, your power, all wrapped in shadow, because you were never taught how to hold it in the light. When the unconscious begins to surface, you can't go back. The glass floor of the ego has cracked. You've glimpsed what's underneath. And no amount of productivity, self-help affirmations, or forced positivity can undo what you've seen. So you numb. You scroll. You overwork. You distract. Because silence now feels dangerous. Stillness becomes unbearable. Every quiet moment threatens to bring the symbol closer. And so you create noise, but it doesn't work. Because the unconscious waits. Patiently, It has no timeline. It doesn't age. It will wait until your defenses soften, until your pain grows louder than your denial. And in that moment, maybe during heartbreak, maybe in grief, maybe in a moment of inexplicable awe, the symbol returns. This time it doesn't ask permission. It erupts as vision, as intuition, as collapse. And finally, you listen. You stop interpreting everything literally. You begin to see the world symbolically. That argument with a friend, not just a conflict, a reflection of your inner fragmentation. That illness, not just physical, a messenger of unprocessed pain. That intense attraction to someone unavailable, not just romance, a mirror of your unmet inner longing. The unconscious doesn't differentiate between dreams and reality the way the ego does. It speaks through synchronicity, repetition, symbolic resonance. And when you begin to pay attention, your life takes on a different quality. Everything starts to mean more. You notice symbols everywhere, in art, in music, in passing comments, in childhood memories. They feel familiar. Not because you've seen them before, but because you've carried them your whole life. And suddenly you understand, you are not just a mind. You are a symbol in motion, a myth playing itself out through your choices, your fears, your desires. The unconscious isn't beneath you. It is you, the deeper you, the truer you, the version of you that doesn't need words to know what's real. And if you want to live fully, not just exist, not just perform, but live, you'll have to face the fear. Not to conquer it, but to let it lead you. Because beneath the fear is the truth. And beneath the truth is the freedom, not the kind sold to you in self-help slogans, but the kind that comes from knowing you've stopped lying to yourself. That is what the unconscious asks. Not perfection, just honesty and the courage to feel. Once you begin to really feel the world inside you, there's no turning back. You start to realize that your reactions weren't random. Your dreams weren't meaningless. Your emptiness wasn't a flaw. They were all messages, symbols, glimpses of what you refuse to confront. The unconscious doesn't punish. It reflects. It shows you symbolically, emotionally, somatically, the truth you are not ready to name. But the ego resists this. It wants clarity. It wants answers in words. It wants to stay in control. And yet control is not what the soul seeks. What it wants is union. Jung called this individuation the slow, sometimes painful integration of conscious and unconscious elements into a single, coherent self. It's not self-improvement. It's self-return, a remembering, a re-embodiment of everything that was exiled in your attempt to be accepted. And here's where the fear deepens, because integration demands destruction, the destruction of your illusions, of who you thought you had to be, of the stories you inherited but never questioned. That's why the unconscious doesn't speak in direct instructions. If it did, your ego would try to manage the process, turn it into a checklist. But symbols bypass your intellect. They go straight to the root. They bring you face to face with what language cannot hold. Think of the dreams you've had that stayed with you for years, not because they made sense, but because they carried weight. Emotional weight, spiritual weight. Maybe you saw yourself drowning, unable to scream. Maybe you were lost in a house with endless doors. Maybe you were being watched. These are not accidents of imagination. They are maps. They're not meant to be solved. They're meant to be felt and followed. The drowning might be the part of you overwhelmed by unexpressed emotion. The endless doors might represent all the unlived lives you've ignored. The watcher could be your own disowned self, the witness within, always present, always waiting for your return. And this return is not abstract. It happens in very real physical ways. Your body is the first to respond when a symbol touches something true. You get goosebumps, or tears, or tightness in your chest. That's not weakness. That's resonance. That's the unconscious breaking the surface. That's the soul remembering its language, not of concepts, but of archetypes. Archetypes are the primordial images that structure our psyche. The mother, the warrior, the lover, the orphan, the sage, they live inside you not as roles to play, but as energies to integrate. And when one of them is ignored or distorted, it doesn't disappear. It becomes shadow. And the shadow does not rest. It waits. Until one day it returns, not as insight, but as compulsion, as addiction, as depression, as rage. Not because you're broken, but because something essential was banished. And here's the hard truth: the longer you deny the symbol, the more extreme its return. You might find yourself overwhelmed by emotions you don't understand, drawn to people who trigger every part of you, repelled by things you used to love. This is not regression, it's reorganization. The psyche is rebalancing itself. The mask is cracking. The false center is dissolving. And the real self, the symbolic self, is beginning to emerge. But emergence is not clean. It doesn't happen in a single revelation. It happens in spirals. You uncover one truth and another appears. You heal one wound and another opens. This is not failure. This is the spiral descent into depth, not downward in a negative sense, but inward toward the origin. Schopenhauer once described the will, this inner force beneath rationality, as the true essence of being, and Jung, in many ways, echoed this. The unconscious is not an accessory to your mind. It is the foundation, and most of what you call you is just the tip of a massive iceberg floating on a sea of forgotten truth. When you begin to explore this sea, you discover how little of your life has been consciously lived, and how much of it has been reactive compensatory, shaped by what you couldn't face. You may feel grief when you see this, a sense of loss, of time wasted, of years spent living half alive. But grief is not the enemy. Grief is the gate. It means something real has touched you. And only through that gate can you begin to feel what was always yours, your intuition, your instinct, your inner myth. Because you are not a blank slate. You are a living symbol. And the unconscious is not beneath you. It is your root system. Every image that haunts you, every recurring dream, every inexplicable feeling, these are not malfunctions. They are messages from the deeper self. And when you begin to listen, your life begins to take on new shape. Not a perfect shape, not a socially approved shape, but a shape that is coherent with who you actually are. It might mean walking away from paths you once called destiny. It might mean confronting the pain you've spent decades avoiding. It might mean facing the terrifying realization that you have no idea who you are, only who you've pretended to be. But from that emptiness comes truth. The truth that your fear of depth was never about drowning. It was about remembering. Remembering that beneath the persona, beneath the fear, beneath the chaos, is a self that has always spoken in symbols and is still waiting to be heard. There's something unbearably quiet about truth when it finally arrives. It doesn't shout. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't demand your belief. It just stands there unmistakable, like a figure in a dream you've seen before but never dared to approach. And when you do, everything changes. Not because you suddenly understand, but because you can finally feel what you've been avoiding. That's the nature of symbolic truth. It's not intellectual. It's existential. It doesn't give you information. It gives you initiation. And if you've made it this far, if some part of this has stirred something in you, then you already know the symbols have begun to speak. And now you have a choice. Not a dramatic one, a quiet, continuous one. To listen, or to return to the surface. But understand this, if you go back, nothing will feel the same. The distractions will feel emptier, the routines more fragile, the noise more unbearable. Because once you've glimpsed the depth, the surface becomes unbearable. You can try to forget, but your body will remember. Your dreams will remember. Your silence will remember. And it's in that remembering that transformation begins. Carl Jung wrote that the unconscious is not just a repository of the past. It is also the birthplace of the future. Meaning, what you repress does not just haunt you, it becomes your destiny, unless you bring it into the light. This is why you must learn to speak its language. Not through control, through contact. Contact with the symbols, with the images that emerge in dreams and daydreams, with the patterns that repeat in your relationships, with the longings you don't yet have words for, with the fears that make no rational sense, but feel ancient, ancestral, rooted in a place far deeper than thought. This is the territory of soul. And the soul, unlike the ego, is not interested in performance. It doesn't care about your productivity. It doesn't want applause. It wants wholeness. And it will sabotage your surface life until you listen. This is not cruelty. This is calling. The anxiety you can't medicate away. The depression that persists despite doing everything right. The breakdowns that come when everything is finally stable. These are not symptoms of failure. They are signals of misalignment, evidence that the symbolic life has been ignored. And life will not let you ignore it forever. You don't need to become someone else to heal. You need to become more of who you are, especially the parts that were left behind. The wounded child who wasn't allowed to cry. The teenager who buried their rage to keep the peace. The adult who wore the smile while quietly imploding. All of them are still alive in you. Not as memories, but as living symbols. Emotional fragments suspended in the unconscious, waiting for your return. And when you do return, when you sit with them not to fix, but to witness, something miraculous happens. The dream shifts. The energy softens. The pattern breaks. Because you're no longer running from yourself. You're standing at the center of your own myth. This is what it means to reclaim your depth. It's not about dramatizing your darkness. It's about integrating it. Bringing shadow into relationship with light. Feeling without explanation. Listening without trying to escape. Being with what is even when it terrifies you. Because only then do you begin to feel real. Not functional, not impressive, not successful, real. And realness is not something the world often rewards. But it is the only thing the soul recognizes. If you deny your depth, you will live a life that looks good and feels dead. You will perform instead of embody. You will talk about healing, but never feel it. You will chase symbols on the outside, wealth, status, validation, while the symbols inside you remain unanswered. But if you choose to turn inward gently, honestly, relentlessly, you will begin to remember who you were, before the mask, before the fear, before the forgetting. And what you'll find is not a version of you that needs fixing, but a version of you that needs honoring. The soul doesn't want to be improved. It wants to be seen. And when you see it, when you really see it, you will realize the fear was never of your darkness. It was of your power, because the unconscious does not just carry your pain. It carries your brilliance, your insight, your creative fire, your voice. The things you were told were too much or too strange or too sensitive. Those weren't flaws, they were gifts. Gifts buried under shame, gifts buried under survival. And now finally, it's time to unearth them. Not for anyone else. Not to prove anything. But because you're tired of living half alive. Because the cost of repression is too high. Because the life you're meant to live is waiting not somewhere out there, but in the symbols that visit you in silence. Listen to them. The dream. The image. The body. The ache. The breath. The strange memory that returns when you're not trying. The metaphor that keeps circling in your thoughts. The feeling that doesn't leave. These are not distractions. These are messages. And when you stop fearing your depth, when you stop resisting the symbols, when you finally allow yourself to feel what has been waiting to be felt, the silence shifts. Not into noise, but into knowing. A knowing that doesn't need words, because it was never about understanding. It was always about remembering. How to awaken the archetypes within you. There are parts of you you've never met, not because they're gone, but because they've been sleeping. Beneath the surface of who you think you are, beyond the voice you use, the name you answer, to the roles you play. Something older is waiting. It stirs in silence. It watches your life unfold like a stage play it didn't audition for. You feel it in moments of unexplainable knowing. In dreams you can't forget. In a sudden rush of emotion that doesn't belong to your present, but to something far more ancient inside you. These are not glitches in your psychology. They are signals from the unconscious. Warnings, invitations, fragments. Pieces of the original self, the one shaped not by your culture, but by something far deeper, the archetype. Carl Jung didn't invent the idea of archetypes. He simply gave language to something humanity has always felt. In myth, in ritual, in art, in silence. Archetypes are not characters. They are forces, primordial energies that move through every human life, regardless of time, culture, or belief. They're not invented by you, they live in you. As the warrior, the child, the sage, the shadow, the lover, the orphan, the destroyer, the creator. You don't choose them. They emerge, or they don't. And when they don't, you live a life of sleepwalking, performing instead of being, coping instead of becoming. Because to awaken the archetypes is to remember who you are beneath who you were told to be. Most people are not afraid of failure. They are afraid of depth. Because the deeper you go, the less of your surface identity survives. You start to realize that what you call personality might actually be protection. That the traits you're proud of, your independence, your confidence, your peace, might be masks, adaptations, stories created to make sure the real you never breaks through. But the unconscious doesn't care about your mask. It doesn't speak in compliments or criticism. It speaks in symbols. And the archetype is its language. The archetype doesn't ask for permission. It returns through dream, through desire, through disruption. It comes as the dream of the flood, the staircase that leads underground, the stranger who calls your name. It comes as sudden grief for something you never lost, or longing for a place you've never been. That feeling, that haunting familiarity, is the soul remembering. Not facts, essence. The archetype doesn't tell you who to become. It reveals what's already in you that you've forgotten how to access. And so the question, how do you awaken the archetypes within you? The first truth is simple but uncomfortable. You don't awaken them by reading or analyzing or declaring yourself spiritual. You awaken them by contact. Psychic contact, emotional contact, symbolic contact. That means you stop performing clarity. You stop trying to master yourself like a project. You let the mask tremble. You let the unconscious speak. And when it does, you listen. But listening is not passive. It is active surrender. It means paying attention to the dreams that disturb you, to the fantasies that scare you, to the moments when someone says something and you feel a sharpness in your chest like they spoke a truth you weren't ready for. That's not random. That's resonance. That's the archetype knocking. Each archetype awakens differently. The warrior might arrive when your boundaries are violated one too many times and something primal rises in you. The lover might awaken when you can finally let yourself be seen without shame. The destroyer might come through illness or heartbreak or the loss of everything you thought made you safe. They are not kind. They are not gentle. But they are honest. They don't care who you've pretended to be. They care about the soul you've abandoned to fit in. You were not meant to be one version of yourself. You were meant to be many, fluid, multifaceted, symbolic. Your suffering begins when you try to live as only one archetype, the caretaker, the intellect, the peaceful one. When you exile the others, they return as symptoms. Depression is often the silenced destroyer. Anxiety, the child ignored for too long. Numbness, the lover who was told touch was dangerous. And if you don't listen, they don't leave. They go deeper until your soul starts screaming through your skin. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he never said that becoming would be easy. Because becoming means disintegration. It means ego death. It means everything you thought was you has to be questioned. You don't awaken the archetype by adding something new. You awaken it by shedding everything that blocks its voice. The opinions of others, the personas you built, the rules you follow so you don't feel alone. And underneath all that, something holy. Not religious, not moral. Holy in the sense that it's untouched by shame, untouched by the world's story about who you're allowed to be. The archetypes are not tools for success. They're not trends to study. They are the blueprint of your inner cosmos. And when they awaken, the outer world begins to reflect what has long been buried. You start seeing things symbolically. You stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking, what energy is trying to emerge through this pain? Because every conflict is a symbol. Every pattern is a myth repeating. Every fear is a doorway. The archetypes are waiting. Not outside you, inside. In the parts you've neglected. In the dreams you've dismissed. In the longings you've buried so deeply you no longer feel them except as emptiness. They are waiting for your attention, for your honesty, for your descent. Because awakening isn't upward, it's downward. It's in the return to the roots, to the cave, to the forgotten, to the truth. And only there will you begin to remember. If the archetypes live within you, then why do they feel so far away? Because most of us weren't raised to see life symbolically. We were taught to look for causes, not meanings. To explain, not to feel. To act, not to listen. And in that hurry to become functional, We lost something deeper, the ability to hear the soul speak. The soul doesn't speak in explanations. It speaks in symbols. And when we deny that symbolic life, the archetypes don't disappear. They become distorted. The warrior becomes aggression. The lover becomes obsession. The mother becomes martyrdom. The sage becomes arrogance. The orphan becomes helplessness. Archetypes do not vanish. They mutate. They twist into symptoms when neglected. They become the patterns we repeat, the people we attract, the roles we resent, but cannot escape. You think you're stuck because you made bad choices. But more often you're stuck because an archetype inside you has been silenced and is now speaking through sabotage. Carl Jung saw this clearly. He said the psyche is not a unified whole. It is a dynamic field of energies, instincts, and symbols, constantly in motion, constantly seeking expression. When those energies are repressed, they don't go away. They act out, in dreams, in crises, in moments of irrational behavior you can't explain. That's not weakness. That's the unconscious attempting to restore balance. You don't heal by controlling these energies. You heal by creating space for them. That means allowing discomfort. It means facing the dream that terrifies you, the memory that still carries heat, the envy that makes you feel ashamed. These are not flaws. They are fragments, pieces of archetypal energy trying to return to consciousness. And the longer you push them down, the louder they get, not in volume, in intensity. Until eventually the body breaks, or the relationship shatters, or the life you built starts to feel like a cage. This is the wake-up call, the breakdown that is secretly a breakthrough. The moment your coping mechanisms collapse and something more honest begins to emerge. But it doesn't feel like emergence. It feels like death, because in a way it is. The death of the false self. The self that was built to survive, not to feel. And beneath that self lies something older, deeper, and infinitely more real. Jung described this as the process of individuation, not becoming better, but becoming whole. Not fixing the parts of you that are broken, but discovering the parts of you that were hidden. Individuation is not a spiritual escape. It's a psychic reckoning, a confrontation with the archetypes within, not as ideas, as forces. And once you make contact, nothing in your life can stay shallow. That's why people resist this work, not because they don't believe in it, but because they sense what it will cost. It will cost the roles they play to feel safe. It will cost the identity they've clung to for approval. It will cost the illusion that they are in control. And yet, what they gain is priceless coherence, not perfection, not bliss, but the feeling of finally living from the inside out. So how do you begin? You start with attention. Quiet, sustained, uncomfortable attention. You begin to notice what pulls at you emotionally, what patterns you're stuck in, what dreams won't leave you, what memories you never speak about but still carry like anchors. These are symbolic clues, not problems to fix, symbols to follow. And as you follow them, you'll begin to recognize the archetype behind the pattern, that constant urge to protect others at the cost of yourself. That's the distorted mother, the need to control every outcome and appear invulnerable. That's the exiled child, the burning need to prove your worth over and over. That's the wounded warrior, the ache for a beauty connection touch that you've learned to shame. That's the forgotten lover, the feeling that you don't belong anywhere, even in your own skin. That's the orphan. None of these are weaknesses. They are mythic energies asking to be integrated. And when you let them speak not just in theory, but in your life, things begin to shift. But this shift doesn't come all at once. It's not an explosion. It's a descent, a slow return to the symbolic, a willingness to see your life as something deeper than circumstance. You begin to see patterns as messages, emotions as maps, conflict as initiation. The archetypes don't remove pain. They give pain meaning. They transmute suffering into transformation. But only if you're willing to feel what you've avoided. And you will avoid it. At first, you'll doubt. You'll rationalize. You'll cling to your surface identity like a lifeboat in a storm. But eventually the storm wins. Because the storm is you. The chaos you're running from is your own awakening. And when it comes, you have two choices. Resist and stay fragmented. Or surrender and begin the long, raw, symbolic journey home. Because that's what awakening really is. Not a moment of insight, but a movement toward integration. A reassembly of the soul through shadow, through archetype, through truth. And only then will you realize the power you've been searching for outside has always lived inside you. Buried, hidden, alive, waiting to be remembered. When you begin to remember what's buried, it doesn't feel like awakening. It feels like unraveling. Because that's what the archetypes do. They don't make you more functional. They make you more whole. And wholeness requires that nothing gets left behind, not the grief you've tucked into your spine, not the rage you tried to outgrow, not the parts of you that still long for what you were told to forget. This is not self-improvement. This is reclamation. Reclaiming the archetypes begins with one question. Not what do I want to become, but what in me has been silenced. Most people live their entire lives inside one dominant archetype. They become the caregiver who never receives, the achiever who never rests, the thinker who never feels, the rebel who never trusts. It becomes their identity, their armor, their script, and everything outside that script is quietly repressed. But what you repress doesn't vanish. It becomes shadow, and the shadow is not evil. It is potential unexpressed, misunderstood, feared, until it returns. The shadow is how the archetypes fight to be seen. They come through projection, through sudden attraction, through inexplicable irritation. You meet someone and feel overwhelmed, not by who they are, but by what they awaken in you. That's a sign, a mirror, the energy you've disowned in yourself returning in someone else's face. You admire the person who speaks freely because you've silenced your own voice. You resent the one who takes up space because you've been shrinking for years. These aren't just emotions. They're messages from the archetype trying to reach you. And here's the danger. If you don't recognize the archetype, you become ruled by it unconsciously. You don't see the destroyer in you, so you sabotage your relationships. You don't integrate the lover, so your need for connection becomes desperate and manipulative. You don't allow the sage to emerge, so you fill your life with noise, ignoring your intuition. Archetypes don't wait for permission. If you ignore them, they will find another way to express themselves, not through creativity, but through chaos. That's why this work is sacred. Because it's not about fixing yourself. It's about recognizing that you were never broken. You were fragmented, and now the fragments are returning. But to receive them, you must stop clinging to certainty. The archetypes live in paradox. The warrior must also learn surrender. The lover must also embrace solitude. The sage must also feel lost. The orphan must eventually choose belonging. If you only embrace one face of an archetype, you remain incomplete. True power comes from holding both. Jung called this the tension of opposites, the ability to contain contradiction without collapsing. That's what makes you real. Not your success, not your clarity, but your capacity to hold what's unresolved and still move forward. The archetypes teach this through experience. You don't study them, you live them. You become them. You allow them to shape your choices, your speech, your silence, your desires. And sometimes they come uninvited, in a crisis that breaks your identity, in a relationship that unearths your vulnerability, in a failure that strips you of every illusion you've used to feel strong. That moment, the collapse is not the end. It's the beginning of the archetypal journey, the descent, the initiation, the place where the ego loses control and the soul steps forward. You might not feel ready. No one does. But that's the point. The archetype doesn't arrive when you're ready. It arrives when you're empty, when the old tools stop working, when the roles feel suffocating, when the performance begins to rot. That's when something deeper moves, not to punish you, to reclaim you. And when it does, your life starts to change, not in appearance, but in meaning. You begin to see your choices not as isolated events, but as symbolic acts. The fight with your partner becomes a stage where the warrior and the orphan wrestle for space. The creative block becomes the lover, waiting to be felt, not judged. The chronic tiredness becomes the sage whispering, "It's time to listen again." You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What energy is trying to move through me?" That's how the archetypes awaken, not with answers, but with new eyes. You begin to feel your emotions as invitations, your triggers as portals, your wounds as myths still in progress. And slowly, a new center forms. Not the ego, the self, the silent presence that holds all the opposites, not in conflict, but in communion. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The self is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious." It is the field in which the archetypes live and express. And when you begin to live from that field, your life no longer revolves around control. It revolves around meaning. But meaning has a price. It asks you to feel what you've